The smartphone shuddered against the cool granite of my kitchen island. 152 missed calls. The current voicemail played on speaker, the audio bouncing off the tile backsplash. Bradley sounded breathless, his voice thick with panic, pleading with the anonymous investor who had just dismantled his career. He begged the phantom billionaire for clemency. He swore he could fix the missing funds. He had no idea the entity holding his financial leash was currently stirring a cup of black coffee on the other end of the line. His own wife. Before I tell you how I went from planning a romantic anniversary to dismantling my husband's entire existence in a single afternoon, I want to know who is listening tonight. Drop your age in the comments below, and welcome to Melissa Told Stories. We have a lot of ground to cover. 12 hours prior, the morning held a much different promise. I navigated my SUV through the Omaha commercial district, early winter frost clinging to the windshield edges. The heater blasted warm air against my frozen fingers, but my mind was miles away, anticipating the look on Bradley's face. My lineage built its wealth upon the quiet grid lines of this state. Freight transit, corn silos, and beef distribution. We learned generations ago that genuine influence operates quietly, preferring unbranded tractor trailers and firm handshakes to flashy corporate vanity. Bradley, conversely, craved the spotlight. When we married 10 years ago, I thought his ambition was charming. I thought he just wanted to prove he could stand next to a family like mine without leaning on our money. Over the past few months, he had been working late, coming home smelling of stale coffee and expensive cologne, talking endlessly about the expansion of Apex Logistics. He claimed they were on the verge of a breakthrough. I believed him. I trusted the dark circles under his eyes and the hurried kisses goodbye. I bought into the narrative of the exhausted executive building a future for us. I walked into the lobby of Apex Logistics carrying a sleek leather envelope. Inside rested 2 first-class boarding passes to Charles de Gaulle Airport and a confirmed reservation at a boutique hotel overlooking the Seine. Our 10th anniversary aligned with Valentine's Day, and I intended to surprise the man I thought I knew with a week of uninterrupted peace. I wore a camel coat, my hair pulled back, expecting a quick smile from the receptionist and a hushed walk to his corner office. The reception desk sat vacant. A half-empty cup of coffee steamed next to a glowing monitor. A rising swell of voices drew me down the carpeted corridor toward the main executive bullpen. It sounded like a holiday party, strange for a Tuesday morning. My boots made no sound on the thick carpet. My footsteps slowed, bringing me to a halt behind a thick pane of frosted glass that separated the hallway from the open floor plan. The barrier offered privacy but cast unmistakable silhouettes. Someone was speaking, their voice projecting over a hushed, giggling crowd. I recognized the cadence of that voice immediately. It was the same confident, warm tone Bradley used when he promised to love me forever in front of our families a decade ago. The tableau unfolding on the other side required no translation. I edged just past the frosted glass, stepping into the shadow of a large potted ficus. Bradley knelt on the polished concrete floor in the center of the room. He wore the navy suit I picked up from the dry cleaners for him yesterday. He held a small velvet box extended toward Victoria, the firm's polished, high-profile chief executive. She stood with her hands covering her mouth, performing the perfect picture of surprised delight. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, her designer dress fitting flawlessly. Encompassing them, dozens of employees clapped, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of cell phones recording the event. "Will you make me the happiest man alive?" he asked. His voice did not waver. He sounded remarkably sincere. "Yes," she breathed, loud enough for the nearest phones to catch. He slid a diamond onto her left hand, a large, gaudy stone that caught the overhead fluorescent lights. She hoisted him up by his lapels for a celebratory kiss, The office erupted into cheers. Someone whistled. A few people clapped Bradley on the back. A different spouse might have shattered the partition. She might have hurled the boarding passes, caused a spectacle, or demanded an explanation right there on the corporate floor. I felt the leather envelope in my hands. I felt the stiff edge of the cardboard tickets pressing into my palms. My chest tightened, a sharp physical ache blooming right behind my ribs, but a glacial calm arrested my pulse. The ringing in my ears drowned out the cheering. I did not drop my bag. I did not gasp for air. I did not give them the satisfaction of my devastation. My gaze drifted away from their embrace, landing on a nearby credenza. Silver buckets held several chilling bottles, condensation dripping down the sides. I recognized the ornate label instantly. It was a rare French Reserve, retailing at $4,000 a pop. I knew the exact price because the invoice for that specific case had crossed my desk 3 weeks prior, billed directly to a shadow vendor account funded solely by my family's trust. Bradley told me it was a necessary expense to wine and dine a crucial new shipping client from Chicago. He said it was an investment in our future. Instead, I was subsidizing my husband's new engagement. The bitter irony tasted like ash in my mouth. The applause crescendoed as someone popped the cork on one of the bottles, the foam spilling over the silver rim. While the crowd surged forward to offer congratulations and get a closer look at the ring, I stepped back. I reached around the edge of the doorway. My fingers closed over the cold, wet neck of an unopened bottle resting near the edge of the table. I pulled it back into the shadows. I slipped the heavy green glass into my tote bag right next to the European itinerary. I took one final look at the man I had spent a decade loving. He was laughing, his arm wrapped tightly around Victoria's waist, basking in the glow of his fabricated success. He looked victorious, like a man who had successfully conquered the world. He believed he had won. Pivoting on the heels of my boots, I exited the facility unseen. I walked back down the empty corridor past the vacant reception desk and pushed through the heavy glass double doors. I stepped back into the biting Midwestern wind. The sharp sting of the cold air felt like a relief against my burning cheeks. The era of the devoted partner expired at that doorway. I unlocked my SUV, slid into the driver's seat, and set the stolen champagne on the passenger seat. By the time I started my engine, the shock had evaporated, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. I was no longer a wife waiting for her husband to come home. I was already drafting the blueprints for his ruin. I did not drive home to cry. I did not pull over onto the shoulder of Interstate 80 to process the collapse of my marriage. I drove straight past our sprawling suburban neighborhood and headed directly into downtown Omaha, navigating toward the steel and glass high-rise that housed my family's legal counsel. My grandfather used to say that a Nebraska winter does not yell before it freezes you to death. It just quietly drops the temperature until you can no longer move. I decided to honor that tradition. Emotional outbursts lose negotiations, and I was about to initiate the most important negotiation of my life. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from Thomas, a man who had managed my family's estate since before I was born. I did not offer tears or long-winded explanations. I simply asked him to pull the file for the Apex Logistics Capitalization Trust. 7 years ago, Bradley approached me with a business proposition. He wanted to buy into a mid-sized freight company that was struggling to manage its debt load. He had the vision, he claimed, but he needed capital. I agreed to back him, but I structured the funding through one of my family's blind trusts to keep my name off the public ledgers. I preferred to remain the supportive wife in the background, a role Bradley was more than happy to let me play. What Bradley never bothered to read because he was too eager to sign the paperwork and assume his new title was the dense legal architecture I had built into that agreement. I insisted on a morality and fraud clause. It was a standard safety measure for our agricultural investments, designed to protect the family from unpredictable liabilities. It stipulated that any breach of fiduciary duty or actions that brought reputational harm to the trust would trigger an immediate and non-negotiable asset severance protocol. Thomas slid a stack of preliminary divorce filings across the desk. I signed my name with the smooth, measured strokes of someone closing a minor real estate transaction. Then, I authorized the activation of the severance protocol. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. It would systematically extract every dollar of the $558 million operational stake my trust provided to Apex Logistics. The firm relied on those funds to float payroll, secure vendor contracts, and fuel the rapid expansion Bradley was always bragging about. Without my shadow capital, Apex was a hollow shell. However, moving $500 million without triggering a cascade of federal red flags requires precision. Thomas informed me the withdrawal would take exactly 72 hours to clear the banking system and vanish from the Apex accounts. The tension shifted entirely. The raw ache of betrayal hardened into the agonizing pressure of a ticking clock. For 3 days, I would have to share a house, a dinner table, and a bed with a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted me. I would have to smile at the man who had just slipped a diamond onto another woman's finger, knowing that I had already pushed the button that would detonate his entire reality. I left the attorney's office and sat in my car staring out at the frozen Missouri River. The engine idled, pumping warm air into the cabin, but I still felt the chill of what I had just initiated. I needed to begin dismantling the smaller structural supports of his life, the invisible safety nets I had spent a decade maintaining. I opened my laptop resting on the passenger seat and logged into our joint insurance provider portal. Bradley had severe exercise-induced asthma. When we married, I upgraded our coverage to the highest premium tier available, paying out of pocket to ensure he had unrestricted access to the best specialists and the most advanced daily inhalers on the market. It was an exorbitant expense, but I had viewed it as an investment in his well-being. I navigated through the administrative menus, my fingers moving with deliberate, clinical precision. I downgraded his coverage to the most basic, bare minimum state-mandated plan. I specifically canceled the rider that covered his expensive daily medication. It was a cold, calculated administrative cut. I watched the confirmation screen load, realizing that the next time he tried to refill his prescription, the pharmacy would demand a small fortune he no longer possessed. Bradley truly believed he was navigating this situation perfectly. He thought he was securing a glamorous, high-profile new bride while comfortably stringing along his boring Midwestern wife until it was convenient for him to leave. He viewed me as a safety net, a comfortable placeholder while he built his empire with Victoria. He had no idea his entire existence was currently being legally erased in absolute silence. I drove home, mentally rehearsing the performance I would need to give for the next 72 hours. I practiced softening my gaze, relaxing my shoulders, forcing the tension out of my jaw. I had to become the woman I was yesterday, the woman he thought he could fool. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Bradley arrived an hour later, whistling as he dropped his keys onto the entry table. He looked energized, glowing with the adrenaline of his secret engagement. He kissed my cheek, apologizing for being late, spinning a lie about a grueling strategy session with the executive board. I smiled, offering him a plate of dinner I had ordered in, listening to him describe the challenges of managing a massive logistics firm. I watched him eat, noting the expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored cut of his shirt. He was a man deeply satisfied with his own cleverness. The first day passed with agonizing slowness. Every time his phone buzzed, I wondered if Victoria was texting him about wedding venues or caterers. Every time he left the room to take a call, I imagined the hushed, urgent tones of an illicit conversation. On the second night, he complained about a minor chest tightness, mentioning that he needed to pick up his inhaler refill the next day. I simply nodded, suggesting he take it easy on his morning run. The irony was suffocating, but I maintained the facade, my expression completely neutral. By the third morning, the strain of the performance was beginning to wear on me. The 72 hours were almost up. I sat at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the digital clock on the microwave slowly tick toward 9 a.m. The banking system was preparing to open. The transfer was queued. The silence was about to end. The weekend stretched out like an endless frozen highway. Surviving those 72 hours required a level of psychological endurance I did not know I possessed. I shared a home with a phantom. Every time Bradley kissed my cheek or casually asked what I wanted for dinner, my skin crawled, but I forced my muscles to remain loose and my expressions docile. My grandfather, the man who built our agricultural empire from a single flatbed truck, always told me that patience is not about waiting. Patience is about keeping your blade hidden until the exact moment the enemy exposes their throat. Monday passed in a blur of mundane domesticity. Bradley went to the office wearing the same arrogant smirk, undoubtedly stealing moments with Victoria between board meetings, feeling untouchable. He believed he held the reins of his destiny. He was merely a passenger in a vehicle I was steering toward a cliff. Tuesday morning arrived with the pale, weak sunlight typical of a Nebraska winter. I sat at the kitchen island long before Bradley woke. The marble countertop felt cold against my forearms. My laptop glowed in the dim light, displaying the secure interface of my family trust banking portal. The clearance timer had expired. The massive sum of $558 million was unlocked, sitting in the Apex Logistics operational escrow, ready to be reclaimed. I did not hesitate. I moved the cursor over the final execution command. 3 simple keystrokes. The confirmation screen pulsed green. In the span of a single breath, the capital vanished from their ledger, rerouting securely back into my private, untouchable holdings. The beauty of the moment was entirely internal. No explosions, no dramatic music. Just the silent, lethal transfer of wealth that effectively severed the financial spine of his beloved company. 10 minutes later, Bradley walked into the kitchen, tying his silk necktie. He looked well-rested, reaching for the coffee pot, completely unaware that his kingdom had just crumbled. I sat quietly watching him pour his dark roast, waiting for the shockwave to hit the shore. It began with a single chime from his pocket, then another. Within 30 seconds, his smartphone erupted into a chaotic symphony of notifications, text alerts, and incoming calls. He frowned, pulling the device from his trousers. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting frantically across the screen as he scrolled through the barrage of catastrophic updates. "What is it?" I asked, my voice laced with the perfect amount of mild wifely concern. He did not answer immediately. His thumbs flew across the digital keyboard, desperately trying to fire off responses. "Something is wrong," he finally muttered, his voice dropping an octave. "The main vendor accounts are locked. The bank is rejecting our outbound payroll batch." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter roast. "Oh no," I said smoothly. "Is it a system glitch?" He started pacing the length of the kitchen. "No, this is not a glitch. This looks like a deliberate freeze. Someone is pulling liquidity out of our core operations." He stopped pacing and looked at me, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. He looked genuinely terrified. "Kelly, we have a massive shadow investor who provided our backing capital 7 years ago. We do not even know their identity. Everything goes through a blind corporate proxy. They just liquidated their entire stake. Without warning. I set my mug down, maintaining eye contact. Why would someone do that? I asked, leaning forward slightly. He shook his head, his breathing growing shallow. A hostile takeover. It has to be. Some ruthless, faceless billionaire is trying to asphyxiate us. They want to bankrupt Apex so they can buy our routes for pennies on the dollar. He leaned against the counter, suddenly looking small and vulnerable. I need to figure out who this predator is before they destroy everything I have built. Everything he had built. The audacity of that statement almost made me laugh out loud, but I held the line. I am sure you and Victoria will figure it out, I told him softly. You always say how brilliant she is. He barely registered my comment, his phone vibrating violently in his palm again. He grabbed his briefcase, kissed the top of my head, and rushed out the door, promising to call me when the crisis was managed. I listened to his tires squeal out of the driveway, the echo fading into the quiet morning. While he raced toward his doom, I opened a separate monitoring window on my laptop. Because my trust originated the funds, I still received automated rejection notices for transactions attempting to ping the now empty accounts. It was like watching a ship sink on a radar screen. The chaos at Apex Logistics escalated with breathtaking speed. By 10 in the morning, the system alerted me that their primary fuel vendor had frozen all corporate fleet cards. By 11, massive docking fees at the Chicago rail yards bounced, halting their freight trains mid-route. The entire Midwestern supply chain they managed was paralyzing hour by hour. Then precisely at noon, the most satisfying notification materialized on my screen. It was an attempted authorization for a high-end exclusive steakhouse downtown. The amount was extravagant, clearly. The bill for Victoria's celebratory engagement lunch. I watched the digital line of code flash red. Declined. The terminal had returned a specific unyielding error code to the merchant. Account liquidated. I closed my eyes and pictured the scene. Bradley sitting across from his glamorous new fiancée, raising a glass to their bright future. The waiter approaching in a tailored vest, leaning down to discreetly inform the rising executive that his black card had been rejected. The embarrassed flush creeping up Bradley's neck as he patted his pockets, realizing the limitless corporate credit he used to fund his lavish lifestyle was gone. Victoria, watching him fumble the illusion of his immense wealth, cracking right before her eyes. The panic setting in across town was palpable, radiating through the digital footprint of their collapsing infrastructure. The illusion of his success vanished instantly, leaving a vacuum where my money used to be. I closed the laptop, feeling a profound sense of closure. The surgery was successful. The tumor was removed. However, as the adrenaline began to fade, the silence of my empty house allowed the analytical part of my brain to take over. I am a wealth manager by training, raised in a family that scrutinizes every decimal point. Something about the swiftness of Apex's collapse did not add up. I provided the seed capital 7 years ago to stabilize their debt. A logistics company of that size maintaining those lucrative regional contracts should be generating significant independent revenue by now. Pulling my operational stake should have caused a severe crisis, yes. It should have crippled their expansion and forced them to scramble for emergency bridging loans. But it should not have caused an immediate total failure of basic payroll and lunch accounts within 3 hours. A dark, heavy question settled into my chest. Where was their actual operational revenue going? Why was a supposedly thriving multi-million-dollar logistics empire so dangerously dependent on my silent cash to simply keep the lights on today? The money from their clients was vanishing somewhere, and I suddenly realized that Bradley's infidelity might be the least destructive secret he was keeping from me. When I originally drafted the severance protocol 7 years prior, my legal counsel advised me about the strict disclosure statutes governing private equity within our state. You can funnel wealth anonymously through a blind proxy for decades, shielding your identity behind layers of dense corporate bureaucracy. My family perfected this practice generations ago. We own thousands of acres of Nebraska farmland, massive freight depots, and commercial real estate, yet our surname rarely appears on a public registry. We employ holding companies to manage other holding companies. Bradley always misunderstood the nature of my inheritance. He assumed my wealth was antiquated and illiquid, tied up in dusty corn silos and rusting tractors. He viewed me as a comfortable trust fund beneficiary who lacked the killer instinct required for modern commerce. He never grasped that the same ruthlessness required to conquer the agricultural supply chain translates perfectly into the financial sector. However, the moment you execute an aggressive withdrawal of an operational stake exceeding 9 figures, federal reporting guidelines demand transparency. The veil drops automatically to prevent allegations of money laundering. A formal notice of termination generates and transmits directly to the executive board of the abandoned entity. It lists the primary trustee. It lists my exact name. I knew the precise minute the fax machine in the Apex Logistics executive suite printed that catastrophic document. The digital clock on my oven shifted to 1:15 in the afternoon. The smartphone resting on the pristine surface of my kitchen island vibrated. The caller identification displayed my husband's name. I did not reach for the device. I remained seated on the velvet bar stool, tracing the rim of an empty porcelain mug, watching the bright screen illuminate the dim room. The phone stopped ringing. 5 seconds later, the rhythm resumed. The relentless, pulsating hum against the solid granite echoed through the silent house. It mimicked the frantic, accelerating rhythm of a terrified heartbeat. He left the first voicemail. I tapped the transcription icon, preferring to read his panic rather than subject myself to the auditory strain of his voice. The text rendered in stark black letters across the glowing display. He demanded I answer immediately. He stated a ridiculous clerical error had occurred at the commercial bank. He claims a legal document had erroneously listed my private holding company as their shadow backer. The tone of his message carried the usual arrogant irritation he reserved for minor inconveniences like a delayed flight or an incorrect coffee order. He still believed he possessed leverage. He still thought he was addressing a subservient spouse who had somehow accidentally tangled her signature in his sophisticated corporate affairs. 30 minutes passed. The reality of his decimation must have finally penetrated his thick skull. His chief financial officer would have called the bank to contest the withdrawal. The banking executives would have confirmed the signature on the mandate. The routing numbers matched. The authorization codes matched. The crushing realization that his quiet, predictable wife held the leash to his entire professional existence shattered his reality. The incoming calls transformed from a steady stream into a torrential flood. 10 missed calls became 50. 50 escalated to 100. I watched the numerical counter climb with clinical fascination. The device danced across the polished stone, inching toward the edge with every harsh vibration. I finally opened the audio files, letting his voice fill the expansive kitchen. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. The bargaining phase began around the 80th call. I could hear the ambient noise of city traffic behind his desperate words. He was no longer in the upscale restaurant. He was pacing the freezing sidewalks of downtown Omaha. He promised to terminate Victoria immediately. He swore the public engagement was a terrible, stress-induced mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the grueling demands of his industry. He offered me a controlling seat on the board of directors, desperately attempting to trade shares in a worthless, bankrupt shell company in exchange for my mercy. He pleaded for the opportunity to come home so we could fix this misunderstanding together. The audacity of his negotiations only confirmed my decision. He did not regret his betrayal. He merely regretted getting caught by the one person who possessed the ammunition to destroy his empire. He invoked our wedding vows, weaponizing the memory of our shared history to manipulate my emotions. He reminded me of the time he stayed awake for 3 nights when I suffered a severe bout of pneumonia, presenting it as currency to purchase his salvation. Listening to him commodify our past disgusted me. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the missed call counter hit 152. The final voicemails degenerated into pathetic, breathless weeping. The high-powered executive who had knelt on a concrete floor to propose to his mistress 2 days prior was now sobbing into his cellular receiver. He confessed that Victoria had abandoned him at the restaurant the moment the corporate card declined, and the severity of the financial freeze became apparent to her. She left him sitting alone at the table with an unpaid bill and a cheap diamond ring she refused to accept once the funds dried up. His perfect new life had not even lasted a single afternoon. I stood up from the bar stool and walked toward the stainless steel refrigerator. I pressed a crystal tumbler against the dispenser, listening to the crisp sound of crushed ice falling into the glass. I poured filtered water over the cubes, the condensation instantly cooling my warm palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid tasted impossibly clean, washing away the bitter aftertaste of the last decade. I surveyed my beautiful, quiet home, noting the soft winter light spilling across the hardwood floors. The battle felt concluded. I had successfully excised a parasite from my ecosystem. I had severed the financial assets initiated the legal divorce proceedings and publicly humiliated him in front of the woman he thought was an upgrade. I had executed the perfect extraction. There was no messy confrontation, no screaming match in the driveway, no shattered porcelain. I dismantled him using the same quiet efficiency my grandfather used to buy out rival farms. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up the vibrating device, and navigated to his contact profile. I hovered my index finger over the red command to block his number permanently. I prepared to close this ugly chapter and embrace the pristine silence of my reclaimed freedom. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind sweeping across the Nebraska plains. Before my skin could make contact with the glass screen, a heavy, urgent pounding echoed from the front hallway. Someone was striking my solid oak front door with the force of a battering ram. I froze the phone, slipping slightly in my damp grip. The rhythmic thudding shattered the tranquility of my kitchen, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. I stared down the hallway, my pulse quickening. Bradley did not possess the courage to confront me in person right now. He was a coward who hid behind text messages and voicemails. The person standing on my porch was entirely unexpected. The game was not over. A new, unforeseen nightmare was just beginning to unfold on my front steps. The rhythmic thudding against the oak panels persisted, a harsh intrusion into the calculated silence I had just orchestrated. Bradley lacked the fortitude for a direct confrontation while his world was actively collapsing. He was a creature of avoidance, preferring to weather storms from a safe distance before attempting to rebuild his facade. The person hammering on my door possessed a different kind of urgency. I set the crystal tumbler down on the kitchen island, the condensation leaving a ring on the polished granite. My heart rate elevated, breaking the steady cadence I had maintained since the Valentine's Day revelation. I crossed the hardwood floor, the soles of my boots silent against the grain. I did not bother checking the security cameras. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, bracing myself for the freezing Nebraska wind and whoever stood within it. It was not my husband. Standing on my porch was a man I did not recognize. He wore a rumpled trench coat that offered little protection against the biting cold. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and analytical, scanning me with an intensity that immediately set my nerves on edge. He held the nondescript leather briefcase tightly against his side, his knuckles white from the grip. "Kelly Clark," he said, his voice low and devoid of pleasantries. It was a statement, not a question. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my posture rigid, blocking the entrance. He glanced over his shoulder toward the empty street, a gesture that indicated he was not making a social call. "My name is Vince. I am a forensic auditor. I work for a specialized division within the Department of Transportation. I need to come inside. Right now." My initial instinct was to close the door and engage the deadbolt. Federal auditors do not make unannounced house calls after dark unless a raid is imminent. However, his demeanor suggested something entirely different. He lacked the authoritative swagger of an agent serving a warrant. He possessed the nervous energy of a whistleblower stepping outside official channels. I stepped back, allowing him to enter. He crossed the threshold, his heavy boots tracking a smear of dirty snow and mud onto the pristine entryway runner. It was a minor physical violation of my sanctuary, a small harbinger of the chaos he carried within that leather briefcase. I closed the door, sealing us inside the quiet house. Vince did not offer to remove his coat. He walked directly into the living room, setting his briefcase on the glass coffee table with a definitive thud. "You triggered a massive withdrawal protocol this morning," he stated, unsnapping the brass latches. $558 million pulled from Apex Logistics' operational accounts. "That is a private financial matter," I replied smoothly, maintaining my composure. "It is entirely legal and structured through a registered trust. I am exercising my rights as the primary capital provider." Vince barked a short, humorless laugh. "Legal, yes. Quiet, no. The morality clause you activated did not just pull your liquidity. It engaged an automated reporting mechanism mandated by the banking statutes you utilized. Your transaction flagged the accounts directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Transportation Oversight Committee." I felt a cold prickle of apprehension at the base of my neck. I expected the withdrawal to cause a localized crisis for Bradley. I did not anticipate alerting federal agencies. "If Apex Logistics is mismanaging funds, that is their liability, not mine. I am merely a silent investor reclaiming my assets." Vince pulled a thick stack of printed ledgers from his briefcase and spread them across the glass surface. He looked up at me, his expression grim. "They are not mismanaging funds, Mrs. Clark. They are embezzling them. Victoria has been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for the past 3 years. She is siphoning revenue from local beef and corn farming cooperatives, using the freight routes as a front to wash the money through offshore shell companies. The scale is staggering. Nearly $500 million is missing from the agricultural supply chain." The sheer magnitude of the accusation forced me to process the information through the lens of my family's legacy. We built our wealth by supporting those exact cooperatives. Our entire reputation rested on the stability of the Nebraska agricultural grid. Victoria was not just stealing money. She was parasitizing the lifeblood of our community. "And Bradley?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He is an arrogant fool," Vince replied bluntly. "He was too busy playing the visionary executive to notice his chief executive officer was gutting the company from the inside out. He signed the authorizations, but Victoria controlled the routing numbers." The betrayal deepened exponentially, transforming from a personal humiliation into a systemic threat. Bradley had not simply broken my heart and humiliated me in front of his staff. His blind ambition and infidelity had tethered my family's generational empire to a massive federal crime. Vince tapped a specific document resting on top of the pile. "That is the bad news. The terrifying news is this. My division intercepted a secondary data stream while investigating the flagged accounts this afternoon. Victoria knew the audit was inevitable. She has been preparing for it. He pushed the document toward me. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of text. It was a fabricated internal memo, complete with my forged signature, authorizing the creation of the offshore shell accounts. Because your trust was the primary financial backer, Vince explained, his voice low and urgent. Victoria constructed a meticulous paper trail designed to make it look like you were the mastermind orchestrating the fraud. The narrative she is feeding the investigators is that you grew jealous of her professional relationship with your husband, and you manipulated the logistics network to destroy them both. The air in the room grew thin. The walls of my beautifully curated home seemed to close in around me. I was a wealth manager. I understood the devastating power of a well-crafted paper trail. In the eyes of a federal prosecutor, I possessed the motive, the capital, and the sophisticated financial knowledge to execute this exact scheme. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Why come to me instead of your superiors?" "Because I spent the last 3 years tracking Victoria's movements," Vince said, leaning forward. "I know she is the architect, but my superiors only care about closing the case, and your signature makes you the perfect scapegoat. If they freeze your assets tomorrow morning, Victoria will use the confusion to liquidate the remaining offshore accounts and vanish. I need the actual routing logs to prove she engineered the transfers. I need access to Apex's internal servers." The reality of my situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. The game of marital revenge was over. I was no longer playing to humiliate a cheating husband. I was fighting for my freedom. If I did not act immediately, if I failed to secure the evidence required to dismantle Victoria's fabricated narrative, I was not going to be a divorced billionaire. I was going to be a federal inmate, and my family's legacy would be utterly destroyed. I looked at the muddy footprint staining my entryway rug, a physical manifestation of the filth Bradley had dragged into my life. The ice in my veins solidified. I would not allow a mediocre executive and her arrogant pawn to dismantle the empire my grandfather built. "How much time do we have?" I asked, my tone shifting from defensive to tactical. Vince checked his watch. "The official subpoenas will be issued by tomorrow evening. You have exactly 48 hours before the federal government locks down every account attached to your name." I turned away from the coffee table and walked toward the hallway leading to Bradley's home office. The time for silent erasure had passed. It was time to go to war. The transition from a betrayed spouse to a tactical commander occurred in the space of a single exhale. The luxury of heartbreak evaporated, replaced by the cold, unforgiving calculus of self-preservation. Vince outlined the parameters of our temporary alliance in stark terms. He provided the framework of the federal investigation, and I provided the keys to the Apex Logistics digital infrastructure. I had 48 hours before the Department of Transportation Oversight Committee formally requested a freeze on my personal accounts, an action that would effectively paralyze my ability to maneuver. I left Vince in the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee and walked down the hallway to Bradley's home office. The room smelled faintly of his expensive cedarwood cologne, a scent that now triggered a wave of visceral disgust. I ignored the framed photographs and the carefully curated bookshelf, focusing my attention on the locked mahogany desk drawer. I knew he kept his primary corporate tablet there, a device he claimed contained highly sensitive proprietary algorithms for route optimization. I unlocked the drawer using a spare key I kept on my ring. The sleek, metallic tablet rested inside, cool to the touch. I carried it back to the kitchen island and set it down next to Vince's sprawling pile of printed ledgers. The screen illuminated, presenting a standard alphanumeric security prompt. Bradley was meticulous about his digital security, constantly lecturing our IT department about encryption protocols. However, He possessed a fatal flaw common to arrogant men. He believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room, which made him predictable. I stared at the blinking cursor. My grandfather, the architect of our freight empire, often brought me to the rail yards when I was a teenager. He taught me to observe the subtle shifts in the wind before a storm hit the plains. A Nebraska winter does not yell before it freezes you to death, he would say, his calloused hands resting on a steering wheel. Neither should you. You watch, you wait, and you strike when the target is looking the other way. I did not panic. I did not waste time attempting complex decryption software. I knew my husband. I knew the depth of his infatuation. I entered a 6-digit sequence: 0, 8, 1, 4, 8, 9. August 14th, Victoria's birthday. The security prompt vanished, granting me unrestricted access to the device. The sting of his devotion to her fueled my focus. He had secured his most sensitive corporate data using the birth date of the woman he intended to replace me with. It was a staggering display of both hubris and incompetence. I connected the tablet to my secure home network and initiated a remote mirroring protocol displaying the contents on my larger desktop monitor. Vince pulled up a chair beside me, his eyes fixed on the screen. "We need the routing logs," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. Victoria used a series of phantom vendor accounts to bleed the cooperatives. The money entered the Apex system as legitimate freight payments, then vanished into a labyrinth of secondary shell companies. If we can map the exact trajectory of those funds, we can prove she authorized the transfers, not you. I navigated through the dense file architecture, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The financial puzzle was vast and complex, designed to confuse standard auditing software. However, I was not running standard software. I was utilizing the same proprietary algorithms my family used to track grain shipments across 3 continents. We raced through thousands of invoices, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and authorization signatures. The sheer volume of the fraud was breathtaking. Victoria had systematically drained millions from the very agricultural communities that sustained the Nebraska economy. She weaponized our infrastructure against our neighbors. Hours bled into the early morning. My eyes burned from the harsh glare of the monitor, but I refused to step away. At 3 a.m., a specific pattern emerged. I isolated a cluster of recurring payments directed toward an entity listed as Horizon Consulting Services. The payments always occurred on the last Friday of the month, and the amounts consistently matched the diverted revenue from the beef cooperatives. I found the artery, I said, pointing to the highlighted data string. Horizon Consulting Services. It is a shell. Vince leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Can you trace the origin IP address for the authorization commands? I ran a reverse trace protocol. The system lagged for a maddening 30 seconds before generating a result. The authorization commands did not originate from the Apex Logistics corporate headquarters. They originated from a secure remote server. I dug deeper into the tablet's internal calendar, searching for overlapping dates. I found a digital invite for Bradley's annual golf retreat, a trip he claimed was essential for networking with prospective clients. The dates of his supposed retreat perfectly aligned with the exact window Victoria opened the Horizon Consulting accounts in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't playing golf. He was helping his mistress build the infrastructure to steal $500 million while simultaneously providing her the perfect alibi. We have the digital map, Vince said, rubbing his tired eyes. We can prove the funds were diverted to Horizon. But the federal prosecutors will argue that digital records can be manipulated. Victoria will claim her system was hacked, and she will point the finger directly at you. We need the physical ledgers. We need the original hard copy manifests with her signature on them. The routing numbers alone are not enough to guarantee an indictment. The digital puzzle was coming together, but the physical evidence remained elusive. If Victoria was meticulous enough to forge my signature on internal memos, she was certainly careful enough to maintain off-site physical records. The question was, where would she hide documents that possessed the power to send her to federal prison for the rest of her life? I stared at the tablet, my mind racing through the extensive real estate portfolio Apex Logistics managed. They owned dozens of warehouses, distribution centers, and maintenance facilities across the Midwest. Searching all of them before the federal subpoena dropped was a mathematical impossibility. We needed to narrow the parameters. I accessed the property management files, filtering the locations by security clearance and access logs. I eliminated the standard commercial hubs, focusing on properties acquired within the last 36 months, the time frame coinciding with the inception of the Ponzi scheme. A single entry caught my attention. It was a remote agricultural facility situated deep within the Sandhills region, characterized by rolling dunes and sparse population density. The property details were unusually vague, listed simply as a specialized storage annex. I tapped the screen, highlighting the location. 2 years ago, Bradley insisted on purchasing this tract of land. He claimed he wanted a private hunting cabin for weekend excursions. I thought it was an unnecessary extravagance, but I approved the allocation to appease his ego. He never once invited me to visit. Vince examined the coordinates. The Sandhills. That is nearly 4 hours away. Why would they store sensitive financial ledgers in the middle of nowhere? Because nobody asks questions in the Sandhills, I replied, my voice hard. And because it is the one property Bradley assumed I would never investigate. He thought I had no interest in his hobbies. The stakes escalated dramatically. We possessed the digital breadcrumbs, but the smoking gun was buried in the frozen Nebraska wilderness. If Victoria realized her servers were compromised, she would dispatch a team to destroy those physical records before dawn. The clock was ticking, and the race against the federal subpoena was no longer confined to a computer screen. We had to move. Vince departed my residence shortly before sunrise. He required specialized digital extraction hardware from his secure office to clone the physical ledgers we anticipated finding in the Sandhills property. Our journey into the remote Nebraska wilderness would commence at dusk, utilizing the cover of darkness to avoid detection by Victoria's private security personnel. Until then, I faced a different kind of tactical challenge. I needed to hide in plain sight. I recognized the strategic necessity of adhering to my typical Wednesday morning routine. In an insular Midwestern society, sudden deviations spark immediate gossip. The wives of agricultural barons and freight tycoons possess an uncanny ability to sense vulnerability. If I remained secluded in my home, rumors of a marital fracture would circulate by noon. I needed to project the image of a woman whose life remained undisturbed, a woman concerned only with mundane domestic errands rather than impending federal indictments. I showered, dressed in a tailored wool coat and cashmere sweater, and drove my pristine utility vehicle to the premium grocer located on the edge of our affluent suburb. The automatic doors parted, welcoming me into a climate-controlled sanctuary that smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh eucalyptus. Soft jazz played through hidden overhead speakers. The polished aisles gleamed under warm lighting, offering a stark, surreal contrast to the high-stakes corporate espionage consuming my reality. I held the power to bankrupt half the town and send prominent executives to prison, yet I was currently inspecting the firmness of organic avocados. I pushed my silver cart toward the artisan bakery section, selecting items I had no intention of consuming. The repetitive, mindless action grounded me. I focused on the vibrant colors of the produce, the precise arrangement of the imported cheeses, breathing in the scent of fresh sourdough. For 10 minutes, I almost convinced myself I was merely a housewife running errands. That fragile illusion shattered near the floral department. Patricia stepped out from behind a display of imported orchids blocking the aisle with her own shopping cart. Bradley acquired his towering arrogance directly from his mother. Patricia was the matriarch of a family that measured success by country club memberships and luxury vehicle leases rather than actual liquid assets. She wore a pristine white trench coat, her hair styled into an immovable helmet of blonde waves. Her posture was rigid, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. She did not offer a greeting. She maneuvered her cart closer to mine, invading my personal space with the entitlement of a woman accustomed to endless deference. "Kelly, we need to have a serious conversation," Patricia stated, her voice lowered to that specific hushed frequency reserved for public reprimands. I kept my hands resting lightly on the handle of my cart. "Good morning, Patricia. It is lovely to see you as well," I replied, my tone pleasant and entirely unbothered. "Do not use that patronizing tone with me," she hissed, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no other shoppers lingered nearby. "Bradley came to my house late last night. He was devastated. I have never seen my son in such a state of distress. He told me everything about your little episode." I raised a single eyebrow, maintaining my mild expression. "My episode?" Patricia leaned closer, her eyes flashing with indignant fury. "Do not play coy. He told me you suffered some sort of hysterical mental break. He explained how you froze his corporate funding out of baseless, irrational jealousy, just because he has been working long hours to provide for your future. He said you're trying to destroy his career to punish him for imaginary slights." The sheer audacity of his fabricated narrative impressed me on a clinical level. Bradley lacked the intelligence to manage a logistics firm, but he possessed a profound talent for victimhood. He knew he could not tell his mother the truth. He could not confess that he knelt on a concrete floor and proposed to another woman using funds generated by my family. Instead, he painted himself as the tireless, dedicated provider suffering the wrath of an unstable, vindictive wife. He deployed his mother as a social weapon, assuming her intimidation tactics would force me into compliance. "You need to stop this embarrassing tantrum immediately," Patricia demanded, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You are humiliating our family. You will call your bankers right now, and you will reinstate his capital." A good wife supports her husband through stressful periods. She does not throw a hysterical fit and jeopardize his livelihood. She reached into the bakery display beside her and grabbed a loaf of fresh artisan bread. Her manicured fingers dug into the crust as she spoke, treating the baked goods as a physical substitute for my neck. "You have always been too cold, Kelly," she continued, her grip tightening on the loaf. "Bradley needs warmth. He needs a partner who understands the pressures of executive leadership, not a spoiled heiress who cuts off his funding the moment she feels neglected. You are going to fix this today." I watched the artisan bread crumble under her rigid grip. Flakes of crust rained down onto the pristine linoleum floor. It was a perfect, pathetic, physical manifestation of her desire to crush my independence. She wanted to squeeze me until I yielded, until I returned to the obedient, silent role her son required. A lesser woman might have defended her sanity. I felt a fleeting, visceral temptation to dismantle her entire worldview right there in the produce aisle. I wanted to tell her about the Department of Transportation. I wanted to mention the $500 million Ponzi scheme her golden child facilitated. I wanted to inform her that her son was currently facing the very real prospect of a 20-year federal prison sentence, and that her precious family name was about to become synonymous with unprecedented agricultural fraud. However, information is precious ammunition, and you do not waste ammunition on foot soldiers. Patricia was irrelevant to the broader war. Educating her would only tip my hand, providing Bradley with advanced warning of the federal investigation. I needed him to remain ignorant and desperate. I let a long, agonizing silence stretch between us. The soft jazz continued playing overhead. A store employee pushed a mop bucket past the end of our aisle, oblivious to the confrontation. I maintained unbroken eye contact, refusing to blink, refusing to shrink under her fierce glare. The pleasant, docile expression vanished from my face, replaced by the chilling, inherited stoicism of my grandfather. I stepped half a pace forward, forcing Patricia to lean back slightly to maintain her balance. "You should ask Victoria how the ring fits before you ask me for a bailout," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. I did not raise my pitch. I delivered the sentence with the lethal precision of a sniper pulling a trigger. Patricia froze. The color drained from her perfectly powdered cheeks, leaving her skin a stark, pallid gray. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. The fabricated narrative of the hysterical, jealous wife evaporated in an instant, replaced by the crushing weight of a truth she could not comprehend. Her mind scrambled to process the implication of the name the ring, the undeniable finality in my tone. Her manicured fingers went slack. The ruined loaf of bread slipped from her grasp, tumbling into her shopping basket in a shower of crushed crumbs. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. The conversation was over. I pushed my silver cart smoothly around her rigid form, navigating toward the checkout lanes without a single backward glance. I paid for my unused groceries with a steady hand, exchanging polite pleasantries with the cashier. I walked out into the brisk winter air, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me. The social facade remained intact, and I had successfully neutralized Bradley's attempts to leverage his family against me. I unlocked my utility vehicle and settled into the driver's seat, feeling a profound sense of clarity. Before I could start the engine, my secure secondary phone chimed from the depths of my tote bag. It was not a text message or a missed call. It was an automated alert generated by the mirroring software I installed on Bradley's encrypted tablet earlier that morning. I pulled the device from my bag and unlocked the screen. The software was configured to notify me whenever a new document was generated within Apex Logistics' executive server architecture. A new file had just been drafted, originating directly from the Chief Executive Officer's private terminal. I tapped the notification, pulling up the intercepted text. It was an email currently sitting in Victoria's draft folder, awaiting final encryption before transmission. As I read the subject line and the attached forensic logs, the lingering satisfaction of my encounter with Patricia vanished. The fragile alliance between my enemies was already disintegrating. The villains were beginning to turn on each other, and the resulting fallout threatened to accelerate the federal timeline long before Vince and I could reach the Sandhills. I navigated the utility vehicle back into my driveway, the tires crunching softly against the layer of fresh snow. The adrenaline from the grocery store encounter began to fade, replaced by the persistent humming vibration of the secondary mobile device hidden within my leather tote bag. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the expansive foyer. The house was quiet, the air still and perfectly climate-controlled. It felt like a sanctuary, entirely detached from the corporate bloodletting occurring just a few miles away in downtown Omaha. I hung my wool coat in the hall closet, walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of chilled mineral water. I sat down at the granite island and pulled the mirrored terminal toward me. The screen glowed, acting as a direct window into the collapsing world of Apex Logistics. I opened the intercepted alert. The data packet originated from the chief executive terminal. Victoria was supposed to be mitigating the severe liquidity crisis, threatening to shut down the regional freight routes. Instead, she was building a lifeboat for one. The digital communications logs painted a vivid, pathetic picture of a crumbling romance. I read through the transcripts of internal instant messages exchanged between my husband and his new fiancée over the past 3 hours. Yesterday, their dialogue consisted of romantic platitudes, dinner reservations, and emojis. Today, the syntax was clipped, frantic, and laden with blame. Bradley begged her to leverage her industry contacts to secure a short-term bridging loan, hoping to appease the angry vendors. Victoria responded with brief, evasive sentences, claiming she was locked out of key banking portals and shifting the responsibility back onto his shoulders. The immense strain of impending bankruptcy was dissolving their manufactured fairy tale at a rapid pace. Pressure reveals the true structural integrity of any foundation, and theirs was built on sand. I clicked on the drafted email currently residing in Victoria's outbox. The intended recipient was an external legal counsel specializing in high-stakes corporate bankruptcy and white-collar defense. Attached to the message were 3 distinct document files. I opened the first attachment. It was a retroactive authorization form designed to transfer primary oversight of the Horizon Consulting offshore accounts away from the executive board and place the burden directly onto the desk of the Vice President of Operations, Bradley. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the digital page. The ink was a scanned overlay, but I had spent a decade reviewing my husband's signatures on mortgage applications, tax returns, and anniversary cards. The loop of the letter B and the sharp descending angle of the letter Y were flawless recreations of his handwriting. She was not simply abandoning him to face the angry creditors. She was weaponizing his blind trust. I reviewed the subsequent attachments. They contained falsified email chains, meticulously altered to suggest Bradley had orchestrated the diversion of the agricultural funds without her knowledge. Because my own financial footprint was too sophisticated to fabricate without leaving a trail for federal auditors, Victoria had pivoted her strategy. She needed a simpler, more believable scapegoat to present to the Department of Transportation. The man who knelt on a concrete floor and handed her a diamond ring 48 hours ago was the perfect candidate. A strange stillness washed over me. I leaned back against the tall wooden chair, staring at the glowing monitor. I held the digital equivalent of a loaded weapon pointed directly at my husband's chest. The federal penalties for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would see him incarcerated well into his senior years. For 10 years, I woke up next to this man. We shared holidays, navigated family illnesses, and built a life together in this very house. The instinct to protect your partner is a deeply ingrained habit wired into the neurology of a long-term marriage. Even after the betrayal, even after the public humiliation, I felt a brief, confusing surge of pity. I could pick up my phone right now, dial his private number, and warn him. I could tell him to pack a bag, hire the most ruthless criminal defense attorney in the Midwest, and secure his own hard drives before Victoria pressed send on that fatal email. I possessed the power to save him from the federal prosecutors. I held his future in the palm of my hand. As I weighed the gravity of his impending doom, a second notification chimed on the monitoring software. Victoria's desktop application synced with her personal cellular device, routing her incoming text messages through the mirrored server. I clicked the new window, pulling up the live transcription. It was a conversation thread with her younger sister residing in Chicago. I scanned the text, expecting to find evidence of guilt or panic. Victoria was not expressing remorse over framing the man she promised to marry. She was not lamenting the collapse of the logistics firm or the stress of the federal audit. She was complaining about the jewelry. I read the exact words glowing on the screen. The stone is pathetic. 2 carats maximum. He promised me a custom setting from a private jeweler, but this looks like a generic mall purchase. I cannot believe I am dealing with this massive headache for a ring that is practically invisible. The brief surge of pity within my chest evaporated, instantly replaced by a crystalline, unyielding resolve. The sheer lack of loyalty between these 2 individuals was breathtaking. Bradley tossed away a decade of devoted marriage and the backing of a billionaire trust for a woman who measured his intrinsic worth by the circumference of a gemstone. Victoria was actively paving his road to a federal penitentiary, while simultaneously criticizing the quality of his bribery. They were parasites, feeding entirely on each other's vanity and greed. Warning him would only insert me back into the crossfire. It would compromise the tactical advantage Vince and I had painstakingly established. My grandfather always instructed me never to interrupt an enemy while they are making a fatal mistake. Giving Bradley a head start would only create chaos, and I required a controlled environment to execute my final maneuver. I closed the draft window and minimized the email client. I left the forged documents right where they belonged. I would let the snake eat its own tail. I brought the geographical coordinates of the Sandhills property back onto the main screen. The sun was beginning its descent outside my window, casting long gray shadows across the frozen Nebraska plains. The digital evidence I had secured was illuminating, but it remained circumstantial in the eyes of a federal judge. To guarantee my freedom and ensure both Bradley and Victoria faced the full weight of their actions, we needed the hard copy ledgers. Vince would arrive within the hour. I needed to prepare. I walked into my bedroom and changed out of my tailored cashmere, trading it for dark denim, thick insulated boots, and a heavy tactical winter coat. The quiet psychological warfare of the past 3 days was over. We were stepping out of the digital realm and driving directly into the isolated, unforgiving wilderness. If Victoria realized her servers were breached before we secured those physical documents, she would not send corporate lawyers to the storage facility. She would send men willing to burn the evidence to the ground, regardless of who was standing inside the building. The stakes were no longer confined to bank accounts and broken vows. We were racing toward a physical confrontation, and the vast, empty darkness of the Sandhills offered no protection. Vince pulled his unassuming sedan into my driveway exactly 40 minutes after our phone call ended. I waited by the front window wearing dark thermal layers and heavy boots. Slung over my shoulder was a durable canvas duffel bag. We exchanged no greetings when I slipped into the passenger seat. The heater hummed a low note, fighting a losing battle against the dropping temperatures outside. Our destination lay deep within the Nebraska Sandhills. It is a unique geological phenomenon comprising vast tracts of grass-stabilized sand dunes. During the day, the region possesses a stark, desolate beauty. At night, it transforms into an ocean of pitch-black isolation. Cell phone reception vanishes. Paved highways give way to rutted gravel roads. It is the perfect place to bury a secret. My grandfather revered those dunes. He taught me that the soil holds memories and demands respect. Bradley, conversely, viewed the land merely as an asset to be exploited, or a rug to sweep his sins under. 2 years prior, he requested a substantial sum to purchase a tract out here, claiming he needed a rustic hunting retreat to entertain prospective logistics clients. I approved the expenditure because denying him felt petty at the time. I never visited the site. I abhorred the concept of killing animals for sport, and he knew my absence was guaranteed. He leveraged my ethical boundaries to construct his private vault. The drive consumed 3 agonizing hours. Vince kept his hands fixed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the periphery illuminated by the headlights. We discussed our entry strategy in hushed tones. Victoria was sharp. If her technology department detected our earlier intrusion into the executive servers, she would deduce our next logical target. Digital files can vanish with a keystroke, but $500 million in falsified agricultural manifests generates a mountain of physical paper. She had to incinerate the evidence before the federal auditors arrived tomorrow morning. We turned off the main county road onto an unmarked dirt path. Vince killed the headlights. We navigated the final 2 miles guided only by the pale illumination of a waning moon reflecting off the frost-covered grass. The structure materialized from the gloom. It was not a rustic wooden hunting lodge. It was a formidable, corrugated steel warehouse devoid of windows, surrounded by a chain-link perimeter fence. Security cameras perched on the four corners, though a quick scan with Vince's thermal monocular confirmed they emitted no active heat signatures. The power grid had been severed, likely a cost-saving measure to keep the facility off the local utility grids and avoid unwanted municipal scrutiny. We approached the heavy steel side door on foot. The wind howled across the open plains, biting through my thick winter coat. Vince produced a specialized tension wrench and a lockpick set from his pockets. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to operating outside the boundaries of standard legal procedure. A satisfying click echoed in the frigid air. He pushed the heavy door open. The interior smelled of stale cardboard dust and the metallic tang of cold steel. We clicked on our respective tactical flashlights, keeping the beams pointed toward the concrete floor to minimize external visibility. Rows of gray metal filing cabinets stretched across the expanse of the warehouse. In the center sat a bank of standalone computer servers, their indicator lights dark. This was the true heart of Apex Logistics. The glittering downtown corporate office was merely a stage play. This desolate room housed the actual mechanics of the theft. "Start with the cabinets marked from 3 years ago," Vince instructed, his voice barely a whisper. "Look for anything bearing the Horizon Consulting letterhead. I will extract the hard drives from the server rack." I moved down the designated aisle, pulling open the heavy steel drawers. My flashlight illuminated thousands of manila folders. The sheer volume of the deception was staggering. Each folder represented a local beef or corn cooperative. Each piece of paper documented a stolen fraction of a livelihood. I found the master ledgers detailing the phantom freight routes. I began shoving stacks of the crucial documents into my canvas duffel bag, prioritizing the files bearing Victoria's distinct signature. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I worked. I reached the end of the second row, my bag growing heavy with the weight of our impending salvation. Beside the final cabinet sat a plastic wastebasket. My flashlight beam swept across it, catching the glint of broken glass. I paused, directing the light downward. Resting among crumpled fast food wrappers and shredded receipts was a framed photograph. The glass was shattered, obscuring the image underneath, but I recognized the intricate silver border. It was a picture of Bradley and me, taken during a charity gala 5 years ago. I had gifted it to him for his office desk. He had not simply hidden the photograph when he converted this space into his criminal command center. He discarded it. He tossed a decade of shared history into the trash, face down in the dirt, the glass splintered by the impact. It was a potent, physical manifestation of how casually I was erased from his reality. He did not value me enough to pack the frame away in a box. I was garbage to him. A fresh surge of adrenaline flushed the lingering cold from my limbs. Any remaining hesitation I harbored regarding his fate dissolved into the dusty concrete floor. I grabbed the last stack of Horizon ledgers and zipped the duffel bag shut. Kelly Vince hissed from the server rack. "We need to go. Right now." I spun around. Through the thin, corrugated steel walls, the low, powerful rumble of approaching diesel engines vibrated against our boots. Vince ripped the final hard drive from the chassis and shoved it into his coat pocket. He extinguished his flashlight. I immediately did the same. Plunged into total darkness, my other senses sharpened. The crunching of heavy tires on the gravel driveway grew deafening. They did not bother with stealth. A brilliant wash of halogen high beams swept across the front of the warehouse, illuminating the tiny gaps in the metal siding. Doors slammed, muffled, urgent voices barked commands. Victoria had dispatched her cleanup crew, and they had arrived with minutes to spare. "Move to the rear loading bay," Vince whispered, grabbing my elbow to guide me through the pitch-black maze of cabinets. We moved with frantic, silent urgency. The heavy duffel bag banged painfully against my hip, but I tightened my grip on the strap. Behind us, the screech of metal on metal echoed through the warehouse as the security team began breaching the primary entrance with a motorized grinder. Sparks illuminated the front corridor in brief, violent flashes. We reached the emergency exit at the back of the facility. Vince threw his weight against the push bar. The hinges protested with a loud groan, but the door swung outward. We spilled into the freezing night air, scrambling down a small embankment into a dense thicket of frosted scrub brush. We hit the ground, pressing our bodies into the frozen earth. 10 seconds later, the warehouse interior flooded with harsh tactical lights. The men inside began shouting, their heavy boots pounding against the concrete as they realized the door was breached and their targets were potentially still on the premises. We crawled through the underbrush, utilizing the natural slope of the dune to shield our retreat. We reached Vince's sedan, parked out of sight behind a neighboring ridge. He started the engine, keeping the headlights extinguished, and drove blindly over the uneven terrain until we reconnected with the main county road, miles away from the compromised facility. I slumped back against the passenger seat, my chest heaving. My hands trembled, not from the plunging temperature, but from the realization of how close we had come to vanishing in that warehouse. We secured the physical evidence, the hard drives resting in Vince's pocket, and the paper ledgers stuffed inside my canvas bag constituted the smoking gun. We possessed the power to clear my name and orchestrate the downfall of the executives who sought to destroy me. The drive back toward civilization felt remarkably short. The sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gray. We had survived the physical threat, but my trial was not yet concluded. As Vince turned onto my affluent suburban street, my phone pinged with a notification from my home security system. Motion detected at the front porch. I opened the camera feed. The tactical victory I felt clutching the duffel bag evaporated. The physical danger of the sandhills was behind me, but a different kind of threat was currently sitting on my frozen front steps, waiting for my return. Bradley was home. The sky above the Nebraska plains began transitioning from charcoal to a bruised, pale indigo as Vince slowed his sedan to a halt at the edge of my property line. Freezing rain had started to fall during the final leg of our journey. The precipitation pelted the windshield, transforming instantly into a slick, treacherous glaze upon contact with the frozen asphalt. I tightened my grip on the thick canvas strap of the duffel bag resting across my lap. Inside lay the physical ledgers, the routing manifests, and the undeniable proof of a sweeping financial conspiracy. I nodded a silent farewell to the auditor. I pushed the passenger door open, stepping out into the biting chill of the early morning. The sedan idled for a brief moment before pulling away, the taillights disappearing into the misty gloom. I turned my attention toward my home. My security system had not hallucinated. A solitary figure occupied the bottom step of my front porch. I walked up the driveway, my insulated boots breaking the thin crust of ice forming on the concrete. I took my time, allowing the agonizing reality of his situation to stretch. Bradley sat with his knees pulled tightly against his chest, his arms wrapped around his torso in a futile attempt to conserve body heat. The posture belonged to a frightened child, not a visionary corporate executive. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray Italian wool overcoat. I remembered the exact afternoon I purchased it for him in Milan during our 5th wedding anniversary trip. The garment was designed for brisk autumn walks through European plazas, not for enduring a brutal Midwestern ice storm. The fine fabric was thoroughly saturated, clinging to his shivering frame like a heavy, freezing shroud. Water dripped from the sodden ends of his carefully styled hair, running down his pale face. His designer leather loafers were ruined, soaked through by the accumulating slush. He was entirely unequipped for the harsh physical reality of the environment he now faced, just as he was unequipped for the tactical warfare he had unwittingly initiated. Hearing the crunch of my boots, he lifted his head. The man who had knelt on a polished concrete floor 48 hours ago, basking in the adoration of his employees and the glow of his mistress, had ceased to exist. His bravado was gone. The arrogant smirk that usually defined his features had deteriorated into an expression of hollow, desperate panic. His lips possessed a faint blue tint. His teeth chattered audibly in the quiet morning air. "Kelly," he gasped, his voice raspy and thin. The word emerged as a pathetic croak. He attempted to stand, using the icy brick pillar of the porch for leverage, but his frozen muscles betrayed him. He stumbled forward, catching himself awkwardly on the frozen steps. He did not try to stand again. He remained on his knees, looking up at me. I stood over him, the heavy duffel bag resting against my hip. I did not offer my hand. I did not unlock the front door to grant him sanctuary. I merely looked down, observing him with the clinical detachment a scientist might reserve for a specimen under a microscope. "Please," he begged, wiping a mixture of sleet and rainwater from his eyes. "You have to listen to me. Everything is falling apart. I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake." I remained silent, allowing the freezing rain to punctuate his confession. My silence forced him to fill the void, driving him to expose the full extent of his desperation. "Victoria locked me out!" He blurted the words rushing from his mouth in a frantic torrent. "I went back to the corporate headquarters after you ignored my calls. My keycard was deactivated. The security guards, men I hired, refused to let me pass the lobby. They threatened to call the police and have me arrested for trespassing in my own building." She issued a company-wide directive stating I was placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal financial review. He paused, gasping for air, the cold visibly restricting his lungs. "She froze our joint legal defense retainer. The commercial bank accounts are empty because of your withdrawal, and now the personal corporate lines of credit are sealed. I tried to call our defense attorneys, the partners we retain for corporate liability. They refused to take my calls. They told my assistant they represent the firm and the chief executive officer, not individual board members facing internal inquiries. She is cutting me off. She is isolating me." His narrative aligned perfectly with the digital intercepts I had monitored earlier that afternoon. Victoria was executing her survival strategy with ruthless precision, severing the dead weight before the federal auditors arrived. Bradley still believed this was merely a hostile corporate maneuver. He thought she was simply protecting her career from the fallout of a bankruptcy. He remained blissfully ignorant of the forged documents currently sitting in her outbox, the emails designed to frame him for a $500 million fraud scheme. "She manipulated me, Kelly," he sobbed, his voice cracking under the weight of his self-pity. "She fed my ego. She convinced me that Apex Logistics needed a different kind of image to secure those national contracts. I got caught up in the stress, the pressure of trying to build something massive for our future. I lost my mind. I never stopped loving you. You are my foundation. You are the only real thing in my life. I know I hurt you, but I need you to help me fix this." The audacity of his plea was almost majestic. He was asking the woman he publicly discarded to sweep in, reactivate a massive financial trust, and shield him from the consequences of his own infidelity. He truly believed his charm and a few shivering tears could erase the betrayal. He assumed my love was an unconditional, endless resource he could tap whenever he depleted his other accounts. I looked at the man shivering on my porch. I felt no residual affection. I felt no lingering anger. The emotions had burned away, leaving only a cold, sharp, strategic focus. The tension in the air was no longer about whether I would forgive him or slam the door in his face. The true tension lay in how I would position this desperate, broken man into the center of the trap Vince and I had spent the entire night constructing. I needed him to assemble the remaining targets in one room. I needed a contained environment to deliver the physical evidence and orchestrate the final federal strike without giving Victoria the opportunity to flee. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us. The sleet accumulated on the shoulders of my tactical coat, but I ignored the chill. I looked deep into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I maintained a blank, unreadable expression, offering neither warmth nor hostility. "Get up off the frozen bricks," I instructed. My voice was level, measured, and entirely devoid of emotion. He blinked, visibly confused by my calm demeanor. He expected rage. He expected me to hurl insults or demand details about his affair. My quiet authority unnerved him, but his desperation overrode his confusion. He grabbed the porch railing and hauled his soaking frame upright, leaning heavily against the painted wood. "I am not opening this door for you today." I continued, my tone slicing through the sound of the falling rain. "You will return to your vehicle. You will turn on the heater. You will contact the remaining investors, the senior partners, and the executive board members who still answer your calls. You will instruct them to convene an emergency session in the main boardroom of Apex Logistics at 10 o'clock this morning." He stared at me, his jaw trembling. "The board members are panicking. Victoria told them I am responsible for the missing liquidity. They will demand answers. They will want to know how we are going to survive the week. What am I supposed to tell them?" I tightened my grip on the canvas duffel bag containing his ruin. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who thought he could throw me away. "Tell them the primary investor is stepping out of the shadows," I replied smoothly. "Tell them to gather in the boardroom. Do not worry, Bradley. I will take care of everything." Relief washed over his pale face, a tragic misinterpretation of my promise. He believed salvation was imminent. He nodded frantically, stumbling backward down the slippery steps toward his parked car, eager to follow my commands. I watched him retreat, my expression unchanging. I turned my key in the lock, stepped into the warmth of my foyer, and prepared to deliver the final blow. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Logistics headquarters, casting long, sharp, geometric shadows across the polished concrete lobby. I bypassed the reception desk, my heels striking the floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. I wore a tailored navy suit, the fabric woven with an imperceptible silver thread that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. In my right hand, I carried a slim, carbon fiber briefcase. It replaced the canvas duffel bag from the previous night, though the contents remained identical. The physical ledgers from the sandhills, the cloned hard drives, and the intercepted communications were now neatly organized into heavy manila folders. I stepped into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. The ascent was silent. My reflection stared back at me from the mirrored doors. The woman who stood in this exact building 2 days ago, holding a pair of airline tickets and a stolen bottle of champagne, felt like a distant relative. The transformation was absolute. I was no longer a spouse navigating the collateral damage of infidelity. I was a corporate executioner, walking toward a designated firing squad. The doors parted, revealing a hushed, frantic atmosphere in the outer corridors. Employees whispered in small clusters, their eyes darting nervously toward the main boardroom. The financial freeze had trickled down to the lowest tiers of the company structure. Everyone knew the ship was taking on water, though few understood the magnitude of the breach. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the primary conference room. Through the translucent barrier, I could hear the sharp, commanding cadence of Victoria's voice. She was delivering her meticulously crafted narrative to the remaining investors and senior partners. I paused, resting my hand against the cool metal handle, listening as she wove a tapestry of deceit. She spoke of tragic oversight and betrayed trust. She outlined a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, carefully omitting her own involvement, and laid the entire architecture of the fraud squarely at the feet of the Vice President of Operations. She painted Bradley as a rogue actor, a man who manipulated her systems and abused his authority to siphon agricultural funds into offshore accounts. I pushed the heavy doors open. The hinges offered no resistance, swinging inward with a smooth, silent glide. The room possessed a sleek, aggressive aesthetic. Chrome fixtures, black leather chairs, and a massive mahogany table dominated the space. 10 men and 2 women sat around the perimeter, their expressions grim and anxious. At the far end of the table stood Victoria, dressed in an immaculate white blazer, pointing toward a projected presentation slide. At the opposite end sat Bradley. He looked atrocious. He wore the same wrinkled shirt from the previous night, his face pale, his posture slumped. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance the moment I stepped over the threshold. The sudden intrusion halted Victoria mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed, flashing with immediate, undisguised irritation. She recognized me instantly, from company galas and holiday parties. To her, I was merely the boring, predictable Midwestern housewife she had successfully displaced. "Excuse me," Victoria stated, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is a closed emergency session for executive stakeholders only. You cannot be in here." I did not halt my stride. I walked directly toward the empty chair situated at the center of the long table, the seat traditionally reserved for the chairman of the board. Security Victoria snapped, gesturing toward a bewildered young assistant hovering near the corner. "Call the lobby. Have Mrs. Clark escorted off the premises immediately." The assistant reached for the wall-mounted telephone, but my voice cut through the tense air before his fingers brushed the receiver. "If you summon security, I advise you to ask them to pack boxes, because the payroll account funding their salaries no longer exists," I said. My voice was calm, projecting effortlessly across the polished mahogany. I placed my briefcase onto the table. The sharp click of the carbon fiber latches echoed like a gunshot. Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. "We are well aware of the malicious liquidity freeze you initiated. Your petty marital dispute is currently jeopardizing hundreds of jobs. Our legal team is already drafting an injunction to compel the release of those funds. Now leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at her, allowing a faint, chilling smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "You misunderstand the hierarchy of this room. I am not here to contest a divorce settlement. I am the sole trustee of the shadow equity firm that holds your operational debt. You are standing in a building leased by my capital, presenting a fraudulent slide deck to investors whose equity I functionally own. I suggest you lower your voice." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. The older investors' men, who had spent their lives managing vast agricultural portfolios, suddenly sat up straighter. They recognized the tone of absolute authority. The dynamic of the room inverted in an instant. Victoria lowered her arms, her confident posture faltering as the implication of my statement processed in her mind. Bradley exhaled a loud, shaky breath. He looked at me with pathetic, dog-like gratitude. He genuinely believed I had arrived to rescue him, to deploy my wealth to shield him from Victoria's accusations. He thought we were a team again, united against a common adversary. I opened the briefcase and retrieved the stack of thick manila folders. I moved methodically around the table, placing a single dossier in front of each board member. I bypassed Bradley entirely, leaving the space in front of him empty. I handed the final folder directly to Victoria. "What is this one?" of the senior investors asked, adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped open the cover. That is a detailed map of a $500 million Ponzi scheme, I explained, returning to my central position at the table. For the past 3 years, revenue generated by the local beef and corn cooperatives has been systematically diverted from your legitimate freight routes into a shell company named Horizon Consulting. I watched the color drain from Victoria's face as she stared down at the contents of her folder. The digital routing numbers are listed on page 1. I continued pacing slowly behind the row of leather chairs. Pages 2 through 10 contain the physical shipping manifests, retrieved late last night from a remote storage facility in the Sandhills. Those manifests bear the original handwritten signature of your chief executive officer, authorizing every single fraudulent transfer. A chaotic murmur erupted among the board members as they reviewed the undeniable proof of their impending ruin. They flipped through the pages, their eyes widening at the staggering figures and the blatant manipulation of their logistics network. Bradley leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "See!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperate relief. "I told you I had nothing to do with this! She manipulated the system! She locked me out! Kelly, tell them! Tell them she is framing me!" I stopped pacing and turned my attention toward my husband. The gratitude in his eyes was sickening. He wanted me to validate his victimhood. Page 15. I instructed the room, my voice slicing through the rising panic. The board members scrambled to find the specified document. Victoria did not turn the page. She remained frozen, staring at the paper, her breathing shallow and rapid. On page 15, you will find an intercepted email draft originating from Victoria's personal terminal, I stated. It contains a forged authorization document designed to shift the legal liability of the offshore accounts onto the Vice President of Operations. It also contains text messages complaining about the carat size of the engagement ring he purchased with stolen corporate funds. Bradley flinched as if struck by a physical blow. The illusion of his salvation shattered. He looked at the intercepted communications, realizing I was not a savior. I was the architect of a trap that ensnared them both. I had allowed him to convene this meeting not to clear his name, but to ensure he was present when the walls collapsed. Victoria finally looked up from her folder. Her mask of sophisticated elegance had melted, revealing a terrified, cornered animal underneath. She opened her mouth to speak, to launch a counteraccusation, to spin a new lie, but no words materialized. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved a sleek silver pen. I held it between my thumb and index finger, pressing the click mechanism. The sharp sound echoed in the dead silent room. Every eye turned toward me. "You destroyed my company," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "I did not destroy your company," I corrected my tone, dropping to a chilling register. "I merely illuminated the rot you installed within its foundation. I secured the evidence required to clear my family's name. You destroyed your own future." The rhythmic sound of the pen mechanism measured the final seconds of their freedom. The board members sat paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare they could not wake from. Victoria glanced toward the glass doors, calculating the distance to the elevator, evaluating her chances of a physical escape. Bradley buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They were cornered. The evidence was irrefutable. The financial lifeline was severed. The boardroom, designed to be a symbol of their corporate power, had transformed into a locked holding cell. But the trap was not yet fully sprung. The physical ledgers and the digital intercepts were merely the bait. The true consequence of their actions was waiting just beyond the frosted glass, preparing to breach the perimeter and introduce a reality far harsher than a lost fortune. I checked the dial of my wristwatch, tracking the sweeping second hand. The time for negotiation was over. The time for retribution had arrived. The rhythmic clicking of my silver pen ceased. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating the occupants of the boardroom beneath an invisible, crushing weight. The senior investors remained frozen in their leather chairs, staring at the physical evidence of their ruined portfolios. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and sudden, overwhelming fear. Victoria possessed the survival instincts of a cornered predator. Her elegant facade dissolved, revealing a raw, calculating desperation underneath the designer blazer. She looked around the table, evaluating the faces of the men and women she had systematically defrauded, searching for a single sympathetic gaze. She found none. The men who had championed her ascent to the chief executive office now viewed her with undisguised revulsion. Realizing her internal support had evaporated, she turned her attention entirely toward me. "Kelly, we can manage this quietly," Victoria suggested, her voice dropping to an urgent, conspiratorial whisper. She placed her palms flat against the mahogany surface, leaning forward. "There is no need to involve external authorities or initiate a public scandal that will humiliate everyone in this room. You have the leverage. You control the shadow capital. I will step down today. I will sign over my entire equity stake in Apex Logistics directly to your trust. You can assume the position of Chief Executive Officer. You can take the company. Just bury those ledgers. We can classify the missing agricultural funds as a strategic loss, restructure the debt, and move forward." Her proposition was a masterpiece of corporate sociopathy. She offered me the keys to a kingdom she had already pillaged, assuming my motivation mirrored her own insatiable greed. She believed I engineered this confrontation to stage a hostile takeover, utilizing her criminal liability as a bargaining chip to acquire her title. Before I could decline her pathetic offer, Bradley abruptly pushed his chair backward. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the concrete floor. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his wrinkled, damp suit. The terror that had gripped him moments ago mutated into a bizarre, delusional surge of confidence. He misinterpreted the entire dynamic of the room. He heard Victoria confess to her vulnerability, and he assumed my presence was a calculated maneuver to eliminate his rival and reclaim his loyalty. He walked around the edge of the long table, moving toward the central position where I stood. He attempted to project the aura of a unified front, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman he had betrayed. "We caught her, Kelly," he announced, addressing the bewildered board members while gesturing toward Victoria. "My wife uncovered the embezzlement. I knew something was wrong with the routing numbers last week, and I asked Kelly to utilize her family resources to investigate the discrepancies. We let Victoria dig her own grave. And now we have the proof to remove her from the board and save this logistics firm." The sheer magnitude of his narcissism defied logic. He was actively attempting to rewrite history in real time, positioning himself as a heroic whistleblower operating in tandem with his brilliant spouse. He reached out, attempting to place his hand on the small of my back to cement the illusion of our partnership. I took a deliberate lateral step to my left, leaving his outstretched hand hovering in empty space. I looked at him, my expression radiating absolute, glacial contempt. "Do not touch me," I commanded. My voice did not rise in volume, but the frigid authority in my tone caused him to recoil as if he had been burned. "You are not a savior, Bradley. You are the bait." I turned my back on his confused, trembling form and directed my gaze toward the frosted glass doors at the far end of the room. I raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my navy blazer to reveal the dial of my wristwatch. The sweeping second hand aligned perfectly with the 12. "I do not negotiate with thieves," I stated, addressing Victoria without looking at her. And I did not bring those ledgers here to blackmail you. I brought them here to ensure you both remained in this room until the guests of honor arrived." On cue, the heavy glass doors swung open. The tense, hushed atmosphere of the boardroom shattered instantly. Vince strode through the entrance, but he was no longer wearing the rumpled trench coat from the previous evening. He wore a sharp, dark suit, moving with the crisp authority of a federal employee operating strictly on the clock. Flanking him were 6 men and women wearing dark, utilitarian windbreakers. Emblazoned across the back of their jackets in bold, unmistakable yellow lettering were the acronyms for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. A collective gasp echoed around the mahogany table. The senior investors scrambled backward, pushing their heavy chairs away from the center of the room, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of the incoming strike. Victoria let out a short, high-pitched gasp. She stumbled away from the table, colliding with a presentation easel. Her eyes darted wildly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, a brief, irrational calculation of jumping before the reality of her physical containment settled in. Bradley froze. His jaw dropped. His eyes locked on the approaching federal agents. The illusion of his heroic narrative disintegrated, replaced by the crushing, undeniable weight of a criminal indictment. Vince stepped to the head of the table, producing a folded document from his breast pocket. "Victoria Mercer and Bradley Clark," he announced, his voice booming across the polished concrete. "We are executing federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across interstate lines." 2 agents moved swiftly toward Bradley. The physical reality of the arrest triggered a violent physiological response within his body. Panic, pure and unfiltered, seized his nervous system. His breathing became erratic, shallow, and rapid. As an agent gripped his right bicep, Bradley's chest heaved. A harsh, whistling wheeze erupted from his throat. "Wait!" he gasped, clutching his collar, his face turning an alarming shade of pale red. "I cannot breathe. My asthma. I need my medication." He frantically patted the pockets of his damp trousers, retrieving a small plastic inhaler. He pressed the device to his lips and squeezed the canister, inhaling desperately. It was a generic over-the-counter rescue inhaler, the kind purchased from a local pharmacy aisle. It lacked the potent specialized corticosteroids of the premium prescription tier I had canceled 3 days prior. The weak burst of medicine provided no relief to his constricting airways. He dropped to his knees exactly as he had done when proposing to his mistress, but this time he was choking on his own terror. He gagged, coughing violently, dropping the useless plastic device onto the floor. The agents paused, expertly assessing the medical distress, recognizing it as a severe panic-induced attack rather than a fatal event. They allowed him a moment to catch his breath, watching him kneel on the concrete, a sputtering, helpless mess of a man. I stood a few feet away, observing his agonizing struggle. I felt no urge to fetch him a glass of water. I felt no pity. The administrative cut I executed at my kitchen island had delivered its payload perfectly. Stripped of my financial protection, he was entirely exposed to the harsh, unyielding consequences of his reality. Across the room, the remaining agents descended upon Victoria. She did not collapse, but she resisted, physically twisting her shoulders away from the approaching officers. "Do not put your hands on me!" she shrieked, the veneer of high society elegance completely shattered. "I demand my legal counsel! You cannot do this based on forged documents provided by a jealous housewife." The agents ignored her protests. They gripped her wrists with practiced efficiency, twisting her arms behind her back. The cold, ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply in the room. As the officer forced her hands together, the sudden, violent jerking motion caught the edge of her left ring finger. Because Victoria had complained to her sister just yesterday that the diamond Bradley purchased was too small, the setting was slightly loose. The oversized, poorly sized band snagged against the cuff of her blazer. The ring slipped smoothly off her finger, the piece of jewelry the ultimate symbol of their betrayal, and the catalyst for my revenge tumbled through the air. It struck the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, resonant clatter. The diamond bounced twice, rolling to a stop directly against the toe of my leather boot. I looked down at the glittering stone, then back up to the faces of the two people who thought they could discard me. Bradley was being hauled to his feet by his belt, still wheezing and gasping for air. Victoria was being marched toward the glass doors, her wrists bound in steel, her face twisted in a mask of absolute fury and humiliation. The perpetrators were removed from the premises, escorted down the corridor toward the waiting federal vehicles. Vince remained behind, organizing his team to begin seizing the corporate servers and hard drives. The boardroom fell silent once more. The chaotic spectacle had concluded, leaving behind a profound, terrifying vacuum. I turned my attention to the remaining investors sitting around the mahogany table. They were staring at me. Their faces reflected a mixture of profound awe and deep existential dread. Apex Logistics was officially decapitated. The regional freight network that transported millions of dollars in agricultural products was currently leaderless, bankrupt, and under federal seizure. If the trucks did not roll by tomorrow morning, the Nebraska farming economy would experience a catastrophic disruption. The emotional retribution was complete, but a massive systemic crisis loomed on the horizon. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, sealing the lingering echoes of the federal raid out in the hallway. I turned my attention back to the mahogany table. The dozen remaining stakeholders sat petrified, their complexions varying shades of chalk. The adrenaline that fueled my meticulous trap began to recede, yielding to the colossal administrative burden looming ahead. Decapitating a corrupt leadership regime provided immense personal satisfaction, but it simultaneously paralyzed a critical Midwestern infrastructure network. A silver-haired investor named Clayton finally broke the suffocating quiet. He removed his reading glasses, his hands trembling visibly. "The fleet is grounded," he stammered, his gaze darting between the empty chairs where the former executives recently sat. "The fuel vendors locked our accounts this morning. We have hundreds of refrigerated trailers sitting idle at processing plants across the state. If those engines do not turn over by midnight, millions of dollars in perishable beef and corn will spoil. The local farming cooperatives will face unprecedented, catastrophic losses." His assessment was entirely accurate. The retribution I unleashed upon my unfaithful spouse and his greedy accomplice threatened to create a devastating collateral impact. My family spent 3 generations cultivating unbreakable bonds with those specific farmers. Our legacy relied upon their prosperity. Allowing their supply chains to collapse because of my marital dispute was an unacceptable outcome. I walked around the table, taking the central position of authority. I placed my palms flat against the polished wood, anchoring myself. I looked directly into Clayton's terrified eyes. "The fleet will not remain grounded," I stated, my voice projecting a steady, unyielding calm. "The financial freeze initiated yesterday served a singular purpose: extracting the parasites from the host. Now that the infection is removed, we initiate the recovery phase." A murmur rippled through the gathered executives. Another board member, a woman handling regional logistics, leaned forward. "How do you propose we accomplish that?" she asked, her tone laced with skeptical desperation. "The commercial banks will not touch us while a Department of Transportation investigation remains active. We lack the liquid capital to purchase diesel fuel, let alone float the pending payroll." I opened my carbon fiber briefcase and retrieved a fresh, unstained legal folio. I slid it across the table toward Clayton. "You are no longer an independent entity seeking commercial loans," I explained. 10 minutes ago, my legal counsel filed a formal petition in the district court. My shadow trust is legally absorbing Apex Logistics. We are converting the stolen agricultural funds and the defaulted operational debt into a controlling equity stake. This is not a bailout. This is an acquisition. We are seizing all physical assets, fleet vehicles, and regional contracts as corporate restitution. The stakeholders absorbed the magnitude of the maneuver. I was offering them a lifeline woven from iron. They would lose their autonomy, but they would evade bankruptcy and federal prosecution. I instructed them to return to their respective departments and draft emergency operational schedules. I promised the fuel vendor accounts would reflect a 9-figure deposit within the hour. The boardroom emptied rapidly as the executives scrambled to execute their new directives. I remained behind, gazing out the towering windows at the sprawling Omaha skyline. The internal corporate fire was contained, but a larger external inferno was rapidly igniting. News of the Federal Bureau of Investigation raid had inevitably leaked. Sirens echoed in the distance, and I watched a fleet of local news vans converge upon the plaza below. The agricultural grids stretching across the Great Plains were already buzzing with panic. Cooperative leaders, ranch owners, and distribution managers were frantically dialing the frozen company switchboard, demanding answers about their stranded cargo. If public confidence continued to plummet, the regional commodities market would experience a severe reactionary crash. Stabilizing the internal ledgers was insufficient. I needed to control the external narrative. I summoned the senior public relations director, a frazzled young man who looked as though he might faint, and ordered him to organize an immediate press briefing in the main lobby. I gave him 30 minutes to assemble the journalists, set up the podium, and route a live broadcast feed to the local affiliates. I descended to the ground floor precisely half an hour later. The expansive lobby was chaotic, packed with reporters, camera crews, and nervous employees. The ambient noise was deafening. The scent of hot electrical equipment and damp winter coats hung thick in the air. A barrage of camera flashes erupted the moment I stepped from the elevator, blinding, white bursts illuminating the polished marble walls. I walked toward the podium flanked by 2 newly appointed corporate attorneys. I did not flinch under the intense scrutiny. I adjusted the microphone, letting the feedback whine briefly before the room fell into an expectant, tense hush. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice amplified across the cavernous space. "My name is Kelly Clark. For the past 7 years, my family's private equity trust has served as the primary financial backer for Apex Logistics. Earlier today, federal authorities detained the former chief executive officer and the vice president of operations on charges of sweeping financial fraud." A flurry of shouted questions arose from the press pool, but I raised my hand, demanding silence. The gesture was sharp and effective. "I am not here to discuss the criminal proceedings," I continued, leaning closer to the microphone. "I am here to address the agricultural community of Nebraska, to the ranchers waiting for transport, to the farmers relying on our silos, and to the cooperative managers managing the supply chains. Hear me clearly. Your cargo is safe. The routes are secure." I looked directly into the primary broadcast lens, speaking not to the journalists, but to the hard-working men and women out in the sandhills and the prairies. Effective immediately, my organization has legally acquired all assets belonging to this logistics firm. We have injected the necessary capital to unfreeze the vendor accounts. The trucks will roll out before sunset. The trains will depart the rail yards on schedule. We built this state on reliability and mutual trust, and I will not allow the greedy actions of 2 rogue individuals to jeopardize your livelihoods. Apex is under new management, and we are open for business. I stepped away from the podium, ignoring the ensuing barrage of questions. I delivered the precise message required to quench the panic. By addressing the farmers directly, utilizing the language of stability and heritage, I severed Victoria's toxic legacy from the company brand. I proved my competence not merely as a vengeful spouse, but as a formidable corporate leader capable of navigating a catastrophic crisis. I rode the elevator back to the top floor, the heavy doors parting to reveal a significantly calmer environment. The frantic energy had dissipated, replaced by focused, deliberate activity. The phones were ringing, but they were being answered with assurances rather than apologies. The market was stabilizing. I walked down the executive corridor and pushed open the heavy oak door leading into the corner office. This was Victoria's former domain. The space was decorated with sterile, pretentious modern art and sharp, uncomfortable designer furniture. It reeked of her expensive perfume and boundless vanity. I bypassed the ridiculous seating area and walked directly behind the massive, custom-built mahogany desk. The leather chair creaked softly as I took a seat. I ran my hands over the smooth surface, claiming the physical territory. I booted up the primary computer terminal. The system required a master administrative override, which my newly installed technology team had graciously provided. I navigated through the digital infrastructure, opening the primary corporate letterhead template used for all official outgoing correspondence. The digital document glowed on the high-definition monitor. At the top of the page, formatted in bold, arrogant typography, sat the name of the woman who thought she could steal my husband, frame me for federal crimes, and usurp my family legacy. I gripped the wireless mouse. I highlighted her name, watching the text turn a deep, satisfying shade of blue. I lifted my index finger and pressed the backspace key. The letters vanished instantly. The space was wiped clean, pristine, and empty. I typed my own name into the void, locking the new template into the central server. The corporate empire was secure. The economic threat to the state was neutralized. Yet as I sat in the quiet authority of the corner office, a lingering administrative detail gnawed at the edge of my consciousness. The corporate war was decisively won, but the marital severance remained technically incomplete. To truly close this dark chapter, to finalize the absolute erasure of my past, I needed a physical signature on a specific legal decree. I could not simply mail the document. I had to face the broken man one final time in his new, miserable habitat. I had to visit a federal holding facility. 6 months is a fleeting interval in the realm of corporate logistics, but an absolute eternity within the federal justice system. The holding facility, located on the desolate outskirts of Lincoln, presented a stark architectural contrast to the sleek glass towers of downtown Omaha. Surrounded by layers of razor wire and towering concrete perimeters, the penitentiary was a monument to consequence. I parked my vehicle in the visitor lot, the summer heat radiating off the black asphalt. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and dark trousers, projecting the exact image of unyielding corporate authority I now wielded every single day. I surrendered my mobile device at the security checkpoint, stepped through the magnetometer, and followed a uniformed guard down a windowless corridor painted an institutional shade of pale gray. The atmosphere smelled sharply of industrial disinfectant and stale floor wax. The heavy thud of electronic deadbolts echoing behind me served as a rhythmic reminder of my own freedom. During the preceding half year, I successfully stabilized the newly acquired freight empire. The agricultural supply chains hummed with unprecedented efficiency. The farming cooperatives signed lucrative long-term contracts, their faith fully restored by my transparent leadership and relentless operational restructuring. Meanwhile, the criminal courts ground my former spouse into a fine powder. Victoria and Bradley turned against each other the exact moment the federal agents separated them into different interrogation rooms. Their mutual betrayal was absolute and vicious. They traded bitter accusations, each attempting to secure a favorable plea agreement by weaponizing their intimate knowledge of the fraud. The prosecutors did not even require a cooperative witness to secure their convictions. The physical ledgers Vince and I retrieved from the Sand Hills facility were airtight. Today was the eve of Bradley's formal sentencing hearing. I entered the sterile visitation room and took my seat on a rigid metal stool facing a thick wall of bulletproof plexiglass. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the transparent barrier clicked open. A guard escorted inmate number 4092 into the booth. The visual deterioration of the man walking toward the glass was genuinely shocking. The arrogant executive, who previously wore bespoke Italian suits and sipped vintage champagne, had vanished entirely. Bradley wore a baggy, faded khaki jumpsuit that hung loosely from his shrinking frame. His posture was severely compromised, his shoulders rounded in a permanent slump of defeat. The expensive, meticulously styled haircut had grown out into a messy, unkempt disaster. His skin possessed a sickly fluorescent pallor, resulting from months deprived of natural sunlight. Stripped of his wealth, his title, and his illusions, he looked remarkably small. He sat down, slowly wincing as if his joints ached. He reached for the black telephone receiver mounted to the wall. I mirrored his action, pressing the heavy plastic instrument against my ear. A sharp crackle of static bridged the physical gap separating us. "Hello, Kelly," he murmured. His voice lacked any trace of its former resonance. It sounded thin, fragile, and utterly broken. I did not offer a greeting. I merely looked at him through the scratched acrylic window, maintaining my composed, analytical silence. "I appreciate you coming," he continued, shifting uncomfortably on his stool. "My attorney said the judge is leaning toward the maximum penalty tomorrow morning. 20 years. If you wrote a character reference letter to the court stating that my actions were an anomaly, that I was a good husband before the stress of the expansion corrupted me, the judge might reduce the mandatory minimum. You are the chief executive officer now. Your word carries immense weight." He was still bargaining. Even wearing a federal uniform, facing 2 decades of incarceration, he believed he could manipulate my standing to mitigate his disaster. He fundamentally failed to understand the mechanism of his own destruction. "I did not drive here to advocate for your character," I replied, my voice steady and cold, transmitting through the wire. "Your character is exactly what placed you in that chair. I am here to finalize an administrative detail." The desperate hope flickering in his bloodshot eyes extinguished instantly. He stared at me, the final remnants of his delusion evaporating under the harsh fluorescent lights. He realized no rescue was imminent. I was not a forgiving angel granting clemency at the 11th hour. I was the executioner, verifying the drop. He lowered his gaze to the metal counter, his chest heaving with a sudden, silent sob. When he finally looked back up, his expression shifted from panic to profound, agonizing curiosity. "When did you stop loving me?" he asked. The question hung heavily in the static-filled connection. Was it Valentine's Day? Was it the moment you stood behind the glass and watched me propose to her? I held his gaze, refusing to grant him the dramatic, passionate narrative he desired. He wanted to believe his infidelity was a cataclysmic event that broke my heart, a romantic tragedy of epic proportions. I decided to deliver the chilling, honest truth. It was not the proposal I stated, my tone devoid of anger or sorrow. The infidelity was merely a symptom of your mediocrity. I stopped loving you the moment the federal auditor laid out the mechanics of your fraud upon my coffee table. You did not orchestrate a brilliant corporate maneuver. You handed the keys of your kingdom to a woman who immediately plotted your demise, and you were too blinded by your own vanity to notice. He flinched as the words struck him. I realized you were never the visionary leader I thought you were, I continued smoothly. You were gullible. You were weak. You were a poorly constructed investment that had finally depreciated to a value of 0. My affection did not turn into hatred, Bradley. It turned into a liquidation strategy. The absolute lack of emotional attachment in my voice devastated him far more thoroughly than any screaming match could have achieved. I reduced a decade of marriage to a failed portfolio asset. He opened his mouth to formulate a response, but no sound emerged. I reached into my carbon fiber briefcase and retrieved a thick manila envelope. I pulled out a stack of legal documents bound by a heavy metal clip. It was the finalized divorce decree. The terms were uncompromising. The paperwork mandated 0 alimony, 0 division of equity, and total severance of all marital assets. I slid the heavy stack of paper through the narrow steel pass-through slot located at the base of the plexiglass window. The document slid across the metal counter, coming to a halt directly in front of his folded hands. "Sign the bottom of page 34, I instructed. He stared at the decree, his hands trembling violently. "I do not have a pen," he whispered. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. I did not produce an expensive fountain pen or a polished silver writing instrument. I pulled out a cheap blue plastic ballpoint pen. The barrel was slightly chewed, bearing the old faded logo of Apex Logistics. It was the exact same pen I had recovered from his home office desk 6 months ago. It was the very instrument he had utilized to practice forging his signature on the fake offshore invoices that ultimately doomed him. I slid the cheap plastic pen through the steel slot. He picked it up. He recognized the logo, his thumb tracing the chipped plastic. The poetic justice of the moment registered in his defeated eyes. He was utilizing the physical tool of his corporate treason to execute the final termination of his marital bond. He flipped the heavy document to the designated page. His hand shook so severely he had to brace his wrist against the metal counter to steady the point. He pressed the blue ink to the paper and signed his name. With those jagged, uneven strokes, he erased himself from my wealth, my name, and my future forever. He pushed the signed decree back through the slot alongside the cheap pen. I collected the documents, ensuring the signature was legible, and placed them securely back into my briefcase. I did not return the pen. "Kelly," he pleaded, his voice breaking as I reached to hang up the receiver. "Please." I placed the black plastic handset onto the wall hook, severing the audio connection mid-sentence. I stood up from the stool, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and turned toward the exit. I walked down the pale green corridor, the heavy steel doors unlocking and sliding open to facilitate my departure. I did not look back over my shoulder. The broken man sitting behind the bulletproof glass no longer existed in my reality. I stepped out of the penitentiary and into the blinding Nebraska sunlight. The oppressive scent of bleach vanished, replaced by the warm, clean aroma of the summer plains. The legal and emotional ties were officially severed. The 12 layers of conflict that had erupted on Valentine's Day were methodically dismantled and resolved. My slate was perfectly clean. I climbed into the driver's seat of my vehicle, started the engine, and navigated toward the highway leading back to Omaha. A profound, unglamorous peace settled over my thoughts. Only one final action remained to completely claim my absolute victory, waiting patiently for me on the pristine surface of my new mahogany desk. The drive back from the federal holding facility to downtown Omaha felt like shedding a heavy winter coat. As my vehicle devoured the miles of sun-baked highway, the landscape shifted from the bleak concrete perimeter of the penitentiary to the sprawling, vibrant green grids of the state's agricultural heartland. A profound lightness settled into my bones. The rearview mirror captured the fading silhouette of the prison complex, a stark tomb holding the remnants of a man I once called my husband. I did not look back a second time. My focus remained fixed firmly on the horizon, watching the heat shimmer above the asphalt. Entering the headquarters of Apex Logistics no longer required navigating a labyrinth of whispers and panicked employees. The atmosphere had transitioned from chaotic desperation to a focused, rhythmic hum of industry. The lobby gleamed under the afternoon sunlight, the receptionists offered genuine smiles, and the digital display boards highlighted on-time delivery metrics across all regional sectors. The Nebraska farming cooperatives had their faith restored, and the supply lines were flowing with unprecedented efficiency. I bypassed the standard elevators and utilized the private executive lift, ascending to the top floor in smooth, uninterrupted silence. I stepped into the corner suite. The pretension that once choked this room during Victoria's tenure had been meticulously stripped away. The sterile, uncomfortable modern art was gone, replaced by framed archival photographs of my grandfather's original transport trucks and detailed topographical maps of the Great Plains supply routes. The space now reflected the grounded, enduring legacy of the empire it governed. It smelled of polished wood and fresh leather, erasing the lingering phantom scent of her designer perfume. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows forming the outer wall of the office. The late summer sun bathed the room in a rich, golden hue. Below me, the city pulsed with life, the arterial highways carrying endless streams of commerce. Beyond the urban boundary, the boundless Nebraska prairie stretched outward, merging with the endless blue sky. This was my territory. The farms, the cooperatives, the freight yards. I had not merely defended my inheritance, I had fortified its foundation, ensuring its survival for the next century by tearing out the rot hiding within its walls. The flashing indicator on my desk phone interrupted my quiet observation. It was a secure external line. I pressed the speaker button, leaning forward slightly. The paperwork cleared the federal prosecutor's desk this morning. Vince announced, his voice filtered through the crisp digital connection. The judge accepted the final sentencing recommendations, 20 years for both of them, no possibility of early parole pending the asset recovery phase, which your trust has already facilitated. The Department of Transportation formally closed the active investigation into your family accounts. You are officially in the clear, Kelly. I leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing my arms. I appreciate the update, Vince. Your forensic work was impeccable. The state owes you a significant debt of gratitude for dismantling that operation before the agricultural sector suffered irreparable damage. We made a highly effective team, he replied, a note of genuine professional respect coloring his tone. My superiors are promoting me to the Regional Oversight Division in Chicago next month. The Sandhills recovery operation looked very good on my official dossier. There was no lingering romantic tension in the exchange, no awkward attempt to bridge the gap between tactical allies and personal companions. Our relationship was forged in the crucible of a crisis, defined by mutual competence and a shared objective. We were two apex predators who temporarily hunted in the same territory and were now returning to our respective domains. Congratulations on the promotion, I told him. If your new division ever requires logistical data regarding the Midwestern freight corridors, you possess my direct line. Safe travels, Kelly, he said, severing the connection. The quiet returned to the corner office, but it was no longer a suffocating, tense silence. It was the unglamorous, enduring peace of total victory. I closed my eyes, letting the reality of my triumph wash over me. The overlapping crises that erupted on Valentine's Day were neutralized. I had successfully navigated the public humiliation, the secret legal maneuvers, the crippling financial vacuums, the federal audits, and the desperate manipulations of my enemies. Society conditions women to respond to betrayal with loud, visible devastation. We are expected to throw plates, scream in driveways, and demand answers from men who lack the capacity for honesty. I chose a different methodology. I recognized early on that true power does not scream. It does not throw tantrums in grocery store aisles or beg for salvation in the freezing rain. True power calculates. It monitors the digital footprint, secures the physical ledgers, and waits for the exact optimal millisecond to strike. I opened my eyes and turned my attention to a small, locked compartment built into the base of the wooden credenza. I retrieved a brass key from my blazer pocket, inserted it into the lock, and pulled the heavy drawer open. Resting inside, nestled upon a bed of dark velvet, was a heavy green glass bottle. The ornate label featured elegant French script denoting a rare $4,000 vintage. It was the exact same bottle I had slipped into my tote bag 6 months ago, stolen from the silver ice bucket while Bradley knelt on the concrete floor and proposed to his mistress. The champagne was originally purchased using my stolen capital, intended to toast my replacement and celebrate the expansion of their fraudulent empire. I had kept it hidden in the dark, preserving the physical artifact as a promise to myself. I lifted the heavy bottle, feeling the cool glass against my palms. I carried it to the center of the room, peeling away the gold foil wrapped around the neck. I untwisted the wire cage, wrapping my fingers firmly around the cork. With a sharp, practiced twist, the cork released. A crisp, satisfying pop echoed off the glass walls, followed by a faint wisp of white vapor. I walked over to the modest wet bar tucked into the corner of the suite and retrieved a single, flawless crystal flute. I poured the liquid, watching the effervescent golden bubbles race toward the rim. The aroma was rich, complex, and intoxicating. I did not raise the glass to toast my ex-husband's demise or his former lover's incarceration. Their existence no longer warranted my energy. I raised the crystal flute to the empty room, offering a silent tribute to my grandfather, to the enduring strength of the Nebraska soil, and to my own unyielding resolve. I took a slow sip. The vintage was exceptionally crisp, the taste of vindication dancing across my palate. Setting the glass down on the polished mahogany surface, I turned my attention to the final item resting precisely in the center of my desk blotter. It was a rectangular piece of heavy cardstock bearing the distinct logo of an international airline. On the morning of my 10th anniversary, I had purchased 2 boarding passes to Charles de Gaulle Airport, intending to treat a man I thought I loved to a week of Parisian luxury. Those original tickets were canceled the moment I walked out of the Apex Logistics lobby, rendered void by the revelation of his profound deceit. The document sitting on my desk today was different. I picked up the boarding pass, tracing the printed ink with my index finger. The departure date was set for tomorrow evening. The seating assignment indicated a private first-class suite. The passenger manifest listed only one name: mine. I was finally taking the trip I had planned on Valentine's Day, but I was undertaking the journey entirely on my own terms. I was not traveling as a devoted, unsuspecting wife hoping to rekindle a fading romance. I was traveling as the undisputed architect of my own destiny, a woman who had burned a corrupt kingdom to the ground and built an impenetrable fortress upon its ashes. I picked up my champagne flute, walked back to the panoramic window, and watched the Nebraska sun dip below the horizon. The fading light painted the sky in brilliant shades of fire and gold. The shadows lengthened across the plains, swallowing the daylight, but I felt no fear of the encroaching dark. I owned the night. I owned the freight lines running through it. Most importantly, I owned myself. My phone remained silent. My empire hummed. The flight to Paris awaited. We spend a profound amount of our lives building houses we hope will never catch fire. In the American ideal of the traditional family, we lay the foundation with carefully curated holiday photographs, synchronized school calendars, and the quiet, desperate assumption that proximity equals loyalty. We tell ourselves that as long as the roof holds back the rain and the front lawn is perfectly manicured, the children sleeping in the bedrooms upstairs are safe from the harshness of the world. But safety is a devastating illusion when the very foundation of that home is constructed on deceit. When we look at the wreckage of shattered marriages, whether dismantled by a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, a bitter eviction in the rain, or the quiet discovery of a second life lived entirely in the shadows, we often focus on the immediate victims. We look at the betrayed spouse. But the true, resonant echo of any family collapse is found in the children who are watching from the periphery. They are the silent, meticulous auditors of our lives. There is a pervasive conventional belief in our culture that the ultimate act of parenting is preservation. We are conditioned to believe that a broken home is the worst possible outcome for a child, a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. Consequently, generations of men and women have swallowed their pride, hidden their tears, and endured quiet, suffocating misery under the guise of staying together for the kids. We construct elaborate facades of domestic bliss, hoping our children will inherit the illusion of stability. But this is where our conventional wisdom fundamentally betrays us. Children do not inherit illusions. They inherit the reality we refuse to name. When a mother allows herself to be treated as an unpaid servant, quietly turning a blind eye to her husband's infidelities to keep the peace, she is not protecting her daughter. She is writing her daughter a manual on how to tolerate abuse. When a father uses a family business as a shield for corporate embezzlement, prioritizing his own vanity over the financial security of his community, he is not building a legacy for his son. He is teaching his son that greed supersedes honor. Children are remarkably perceptive barometers of emotional truth. They notice when the laughter at the dinner table does not reach the eyes. They recognize the heavy, loaded silence that follows a slammed door. They absorb the specific frequency of a lie long before they possess the vocabulary to articulate it. The most profound lesson we can offer the next generation requires a radical shift in how we define family responsibility. True parental guidance is not about shielding a child from the storm. It is about showing them exactly how to stand firm when the wind threatens to tear the roof off. Consider the sheer emotional fortitude required to face a devastating betrayal, not with a hysterical breakdown, but with clinical, icy precision. When a spouse uncovers a deception and chooses to methodically sever the ties, refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for demanding fairness, they are executing the ultimate act of long-term guidance. They are demonstrating that self-worth is not negotiable. They are proving that a life lived in authentic independence, however lonely it may initially feel, is infinitely superior to a life lived in comfortable subjugation. This brings us to a counter-conventional truth that is rarely discussed in the pristine circles of modern parenting. Sometimes, the absolute best way to protect a child is to systematically dismantle the toxic structure they live in. We must stop teaching our children that loyalty means blindly standing by someone who repeatedly compromises their safety and dignity. Instead, we must teach them the value of emotional awareness and the absolute necessity of boundaries. Fairness in a family does not mean everyone gets an equal share of a happy ending. It means that actions have undeniable consequences. When we hold a cheating or fraudulent partner accountable, stripping them of their unearned privileges and forcing them to face the stark reality of their choices, we provide our children with a masterclass in justice. We show them that love without respect is merely a hostage situation masquerading as romance. Yet this dismantling must be balanced with the quiet, unglamorous heroism of choosing to build something real. As we saw in the stories of unexpected grace, family is not strictly defined by the blood in our veins or the legal documents filed in a county courthouse. Sometimes family is a grieving 8-year-old boy and a structural engineer who simply refuses to stop showing up on Sunday mornings. Family is the consistency of a promise kept when it is entirely inconvenient. It is the willingness to fold an unexpected child, a grieving widow, or a weary grandfather into your own life, not out of obligation, but out of a profound, radical empathy. This is the dual mandate of raising children in a complex world. We must have the courage to burn down the false monuments we have erected, and we must possess the tender, enduring strength to nurture the genuine connections that rise from the ashes. We must teach them that true power does not scream from a boardroom or demand subservience in a kitchen. True power calculates, observes, and acts with unyielding integrity. It is the ability to look at a broken, painful truth and say, I will not inherit this, and I will not pass it down. We all have these pivotal moments waiting for us. Moments where the polished veneer of our lives cracks, revealing the raw wood underneath. How we choose to handle the splintering will define the narrative our children carry forward into their own lives. Will we desperately try to glue the pieces back together, pretending the damage never occurred? Or will we have the courage to build a new table entirely? I would love to know how these themes resonate with the reality of your own family history. Have you ever had to dismantle an illusion to protect someone you love? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. We navigate these complex, deeply human experiences together, uncovering the quiet truths hidden in our everyday lives. Make sure to subscribe and follow Melissa Told Stories so you never miss an opportunity to explore the narratives that shape us. We spend our entire lives terrified of the dark, teaching our children to lock the doors against the monsters waiting outside. But the most terrifying revelation of adulthood is realizing that the lock was never meant to keep the monsters out. Sometimes, the lock was only there to keep us trapped inside with them. The ultimate act of love is not fortifying the door. It is finally turning the key, stepping out into the freezing rain, and teaching your children that they were born to survive the storm, not the cage.